requested. As previously announced, further proceedings on the question will be postponed. Okay. Clerk, report the Garcia amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is amendment number...
Wait. The clerk needs to report it first.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4435, offered by Mr. Garcia of California.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. I reserve a point of order. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to the committee. I just want to be also clear. The act that's being discussed is really nothing more than a scheme to cripple Congress and to give right-wing extremists more and more opportunities to sabotage our government and eliminate essentially programs that help people. So eliminating agencies and programs which are funded each year through Congress, even though committees haven't consistently reauthorized them, sounds like a good idea, I know, to some, until you realize it's really just a tool to cripple agencies and programs that House Republicans might deem unworthy. So this is despite Americans' overwhelming support for these programs. Now, let's actually consider if this bill, the so-called USA Act, were into effect today. The bill would cut 10% of funding for the National Institutes of Health, essentially destroying our public health research and leaving us wide open to the threat of future pandemics. Then another 15% cut the next year, and another 15% cut the year after that. So essentially eliminating the National Institutes of Health in our government. It would slash, to be clear, veterans' medical care. It would slash and defund and gut NASA. And in 3 years, it would end all funding for Section 8 housing and throw families out onto the street when we have a homelessness crisis happening across the country and in many of our states. It would also slash programs that fight lead poisoning, asthma, or epilepsy in children. And it essentially would defund and end the FBI as we know it. And now I know that many of my colleagues in this committee would probably welcome that in their blind defense of indicted criminal Donald Trump. And certainly there's been members of this committee that have actually called to actually defund the FBI and law enforcement. But we know that the American people overwhelmingly recognize that this is a ridiculous proposal. Now, the party that claims to support law enforcement would also eventually abolish the U.S. Marshal Service with this act. And also important programs for federal and local state law enforcement officers that are critical would all be damaged because of these cuts that would happen year after year after year. I want to remind my friends in the majority on this committee that they actually control the agenda, and if they would like to write authorizations for these programs, they should go right ahead and do those. But we know that House Republicans won't do any of the work of actually governing the country, but they're really here to cripple our government. And that's why I'm offering this amendment, which is to save some of the most critical programs, which are funded at over $10 billion a year, and each of which would face massive cuts under this extreme proposal. So let's be clear, if you vote against this amendment and for this bill, you're voting to cut veterans' health care, slash the National Institutes of Health, throw families out of housing through Section 8, gut NASA, and defund the FBI. So please support my amendment and vote no on the underlying bill. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I oppose this amendment because it undermines the purpose of the bill. This legislation is intended to force Congress to give the appropriate oversight and legislative attention to every agency and program within their appropriate authorizing committee. The USA Act will force long overdue deliberations to take place. This amendment would exempt programs under $10 billion in funding from the requirements of the Act. That would exempt the majority of federal programs and make the bill moot. Congress should be conducting regular oversight of all programs at all funding levels to ensure that American taxpayer dollars are spent responsibly. This is by design to give the appropriate legislative authorization committees time to do their oversight and authorization work. For these reasons, I oppose the Garcia amendment. Does any other member wish to be heard?
Mr. Chair, can I also have a recorded vote, please?
Okay.
Oh, actually, Mr. Raskin, I'll yield my time.
All right. Chair recognizes Mr. Raskin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of Mr. Garcia's amendment, and I thank him for his care in developing it. You know, I guess what troubles me about the whole exercise is that there's a kind of devil-may-care cavalierness about the whole thing, as if the sponsors know it's not really going to happen, so they can just make a statement with the bill. If there's a serious problem with us voting for appropriations for programs where the underlying authorization is lapsed, then we should have hearings about that, and we should analyze how to move forward in a serious and constructive way. But I don't think anybody believes that this is productive unless the idea really is to throw veterans off of their health care and to end our funding for Head Start and so on. Because, as we said before, we know that there will be enough opposition within the GOP majority caucus that there won't be the ability to actually get those programs authorized, especially with such a tiny, slender margin and such tumult and turbulence within the GOP caucus right now, and the dependence on the votes of members like George Santos. So I would much prefer if we'd spent our time actually examining the problem rather than going through the motions of this pretend legislation. But in any event, if we're going to move forward with this rather hollow exercise, we certainly need to adopt Mr. Garcia's amendment, because if we don't, we could end up doing some serious damage, and I yield back.
Do any other members wish to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment offered by Mr. Garcia. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. And the amendment, Mr. Garcia.
Recorded vote, please, if I could request that.
Request a recorded vote. As previously announced, further proceedings on the question will be postponed. Do any other members wish to be recognized for the purpose of offering an amendment? Ms. Crockett?
Yes, Mr. Chair, may I proceed?
Will the clerk please report the Crockett amendment?
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4435 as offered by Ms. Crockett of Texas.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. I reserve a point of order. The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask consent to offer an amendment to Bill H.R. 4435, the Unauthorized Spending Accountability Act. Under this bill, there will be a reoccurring 3-year budgetary level reduction cycle with respect to any unauthorized program beginning in fiscal year 2024, consistent with the requirements of this act. My amendment would exempt the administration and operation of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, from this bill. As we all know, FEMA's primary mission is to help those within the country before, during, and after disasters. Disasters can come in many forms. FEMA responds to all declared domestic disasters and emergencies, whether natural or man-made, whether it is responding to a severe storm like those in Arkansas, Florida, Oklahoma, or Texas, wildfires or severe flooding, or even horrific events like those from 9/11. FEMA has never faltered from assisting those who have experienced horrific events that have altered the lives and livelihoods of U.S. citizens. However, with extreme weather events happening like hurricanes and tornadoes becoming more and more prevalent, I have grave concerns of the impact of this bill on FEMA's ability to help our constituents. FEMA has assisted in shelter, food, clothing, health, and housing during moments when our constituents are facing some of the most challenging that they've ever faced in their lives. For example, over the last year, FEMA has spent more than $9 billion in assisting our constituents impacted by Hurricane Ian. But FEMA relief also is being provided across the country to areas hit by wildfires, floods, mudslides, and more. As one of my colleagues recently stated, emergency management cannot be politicized and should always be prioritized. Accordingly, while I believe all of us want a government that is fiscally responsible, I believe we also want a government that is accountable and reliable to its people in times of disaster and tragedy. That is why I believe this amendment is vital and should be adopted. And let me just add to this. When we start talking about FEMA and the work that FEMA doesn't just do work in red states, blue states, or help out just independents. FEMA helps everyone out. And we recently here in D.C. Were actually under air quality warning simply because of the wildfires that were spreading from Canada. So we know that these events are occurring. And so the last thing that I'd like to do is pretend that any of us have a magic globe that will allow us to tell us how many disasters are coming and how much money is going to be necessary to adequately take care of our shared constituencies.
Will the gentlelady yield for a question?
Absolutely.
Ms. Crockett, thank you for your leadership in bringing forward this amendment. As you were talking, it made me wonder why the majority, since it is in the majority, if they care about the authorization of FEMA or any other agency, why don't they just move to authorize it and put that on the agenda rather than moving to defund all of these agencies unless they are authorized? In other words, why don't they take the positive step of moving forward to authorize? And I wonder if you have any insight into that.
I actually don't. I have no insight as to why we wouldn't move to authorize such agencies such as this one, considering the important work that's done. And like I said, this isn't, I come technically from a red state, but let me tell you that we've had historic flooding down in Houston that so many people still haven't recovered from. We've had historic flooding in Dallas as well. And not to mention, as someone who also serves on the Ag Committee, just listening to my farmers and them talking about the historic droughts and the burning that's happening, as well as the flooding. This is affecting their livelihoods. And so their shared stories of what's happening in Texas, especially for our farmers, is happening throughout the entire country in rural America. So this is really important, no matter really what state you come from, that we don't strap them down, because the one thing that we do know is that there is an emergency coming. The one thing that we don't know is how much it's gonna cost us.
Gentlelady, you yield back?
I yield.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. This amendment unfortunately goes directly against the problem the USA Act is trying to solve. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, is the primary agency designed by Congress to ensure our safety and readiness should disaster strike our great country. I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would agree that FEMA's programs, which aim to provide a safety net in the case of emergencies, are important enough for Congress to examine on a regular basis. Are we the authorization committee with relevant expertise of FEMA? No. So I would defer to my colleagues, Chairman Mark Green and Ranking Member Bernie Thompson, and their members as to the legal authority and authorized appropriations FEMA needs to deliver on its mission. But I do know this: the Homeland Security Committee should be conducting regular oversight of FEMA and not letting this critical executive branch agency run on autopilot. Because of this, I urge my colleagues to oppose the Crockett Amendment, and I yield back. Do any other members wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of this amendment, and I thank Ms. Crockett for laying out in important detail and with a lot of evidence why it is so important. FEMA is our emergency management and emergency response agency, and it is charged with responding to unforeseen emergencies that is therefore in and of itself very difficult to identify and predict. And if we are going to reduce the amount of money available to FEMA simply because they cannot designate or specifically authorize their money, we are undermining the purpose of FEMA and the essential work that it does. And I think Ms. Crockett's point that this is not a red state or blue state issue is very well taken. This is an American issue. And I would note that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle can rail against government spending, can oppose government spending, but when there's an emergency in their district, they are the first to reach out to FEMA and the federal government for assistance. And so the fact that that this bill would potentially and almost automatically limit FEMA's resources undermines the important work it does and will have a detrimental effect to Americans all around the country. And I yield back.
Does any other member wish to speak on the Crockett Amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the Crockett Amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. And Ms. Crockett?
I'd ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested and ordered as previously announced. Further proceedings on the question will be postponed. All right. Do any other members wish to be recognized for the purpose of offering an amendment?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
Will the clerk please report Raskin number